Hello, everyone. I think the last time I've been in a place like this was in a church. When I was very young. I would like to say thank you to Cosme and to Anna to this invitation to attend this conference. I feel very excited to share this research in process here in this context and to have the opportunity to discuss with you if we have time at the end. I will try to respect the 30 minutes. For this reason, I prepared a paper and I will be completely reading that. This one is a case of study, which I'll try to present briefly here, that is slowly gaining different forms and spaces of visibility. One of that is in the exhibition that Inti is curating and invited me to present a micro space with this episode that I will present here in Rio de Janeiro, in the Museum of Art of Rio. Art Museum of Rio. For this event, I thought in conversation with Cosmin that the most interesting thing to do would be to present a kind of historical and intuitive research methodology concerning what was once completely unknown historical episode, and then reflect on its recent various insertions in exhibition space. But before that, I would like to make a kind of genealogy of research, because I think it's very important to know how this methodology is really, really intuitive. So this research process was guided by affective links, but also by a clear necessity, the construction of a collective memory. During 2008 and 2009, I was participating in an independent study program at MACBA, and in those years, the philosopher and queer activist Beatriz Preciado offered a workshop entitled Social Dangerousness, Desiring Minorities, Actions and Practices in the 70s and 80s in the Spanish state. The workshop on collective research projects had different work steps, processes and reflections and visualizations over those 2 years. Especially during the workshops, classes, and seminars Preciado was conducting at MACBA, I was constantly wondering which artistic practices in Brazil and Latin America were embodying such a powerful critical discourse against a binary matrix of gender in the 70s and 80s. Simultaneously, during those years, I was working on a dissertation that aimed to analyze the aesthetic politics around Brazilian concrete poetry of the 50s, its connection with the Russian constructivism, its absence in the field of literature, and its disturbing presence at the conceptual art collection of the Museum of Contemporary Art, University of São Paulo, where I studied before. At that time, the Southern Conceptualism Network was initiated, and I joined almost immediately because of many political and emotional affinities. With this workshop, I started researching the alternative artistic networks and publications of visual poetry and male art. I started discussing daily research and reflections with some of the members, who generously offered materials, paths, questions, and provocations, as well as invitations to write and search together. Already implicit in this little history are several elements that would gradually take me to where I will lead you today here. A primary interest in poetic and artistic practices capable of questioning their field of production, insertion, and incidence, in the case of concrete poetry. The experimentation with language, whether verbal, visual, or from the body. Artistic ways of doing for the visualization of the artistic practices themselves, collective work and networking, the political activation of artistic practices and activism, and the production of critical historiography of from the South. It was an urgent task to confront the hegemonic discourses of art that have for so long, maybe since colonization, have been displacing and discontextualizing local artistic memory from their political struggles in order to establish their insertion in a global discourse of aestheticization. And finally, for the first approach to critical theories of gender through transfeminism and queer theory. So I was gradually moving from the academic research almost exclusively bookish, based on a European model of education set snugly in the universities in Brazil, to a more direct form of research in personal archives, built on storytelling, on listening, affection, patience, respect, discussion, in questioning, and in millions of photographs and raw footage produced in those moments of exchange. Many archives were visited and temporarily occupied, not only in Latin America, but in places where Latin America was exiled to escape local censorship in times of political repression. Several stories, geographies, temporalities, subject, and expectations were intersected in these archives. And then I found many materials interconnecting different geographies, tiny pieces, perhaps imperceptible, in the multitude of materials that can offer a personal archive, but visible and essential for those new strong questions that began to run in my body. In early 2011, I moved to Buenos Aires, and there I met a collective that organizes Porno por Si Festival. The name means Why Not, Why Yes, or Porn, Cause Yes, which includes many young Brazilian post-pornography filmmakers and performers. In the preparatory... In the preparatory meetings and the planning sessions of the festival that would happen in July 2011, other questions that just popped up. Where was the post-pornography discourse in Latin America before being known as such in the present? It did not seem possible that there was not a questioning of normative sexualities and corporeality, a heterosexual patriarchal binary order in aesthetic experiences in the early decades. Yet, the arrival in the case of porno art movement.
Perder la forma humana, el título de esta exposición, nos parece una imagen muy precisa de la mutación.
Sorry.
Por un lado, los efectos
could you stop the video?
Cuerpos,
I think I just run the...
que instaló en...
Yeah, please. And put back the... Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yet the arrival in the case of the porno art movement is completely related to the process of exchange with the research team of Losing the Human Form exhibition, which ran between 2010 and 2012. In one of the first meetings of this project, a great friend, the Brazilian researcher André Mesquita, said to me that he had shared my interest in gender issues and dissident sexualities with one of the participants of the collective Tres Nós Três, Three Nodes, We Three, which he was working on. This person was Mário Ramiro, which Udi Nilson Jr. and Rafael França artistically vandalized the city of São Paulo in the 80s with impressive artistic installations in various forms of symbolic complaint. Ramiro suggested I contacted Eduardo Cac and asked him about an edited video of one porn art, the porn art movement action in the beginning of the 80s. Then I had a name and a desire to find out more. And my first impulse with this name was just to Google it. And I found practically nothing. So I scanned the second-hand bookstores in Brazil, and I found the first book, the first main book of the movement, that was Anthology in Rio de Janeiro, where I was living at that time. I devoured the book in one day, and at the same time, an email to Eduardo Cac I just sent an email to Eduardo Cac, today a famous artist for his experiments with new media and technology. Then I began a long research relationship of hours and years by Skype. Questions and doubts were taken to him to open each time more and more folders from 30 years ago in his files. I also meant that he spent time recovering materials stored at a farm in Rio de Janeiro. What was initially only a video skyrocketed, and later on I reached the other members of the movement. So now I'll talk a bit about the, not the first stage, but the first space where I could show this material, and it was very related to other episodes and cases in Latin America. It's the exhibition Losing the Human Form that you see the video now that shows a bit the space. Now it's not working. Could you put the video? The project started in late 2010, as I said before, when the network received the invitation for the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid to formulate an exhibition from these mapped archives. At first, we thought about articulating episodes related to art activism and political memory in Latin America in 4 basic nuclei of action related to research undertaken. Activism on the streets, sexual disobedience, occupation of spaces, and alternative artist networks. Coordinators were designated for each of those initial nuclei, and they would organize frequent meetings with their research teams to select materials and cases in accordance with the objectives collectively defined and in the coordination meetings. In these coordination meetings, we are also shared connections, gaps, and confrontations between practices of different regions. Importantly, participants of each team could be part of more than one research group, and the coordinators themselves were part of the research team in other cores. Early in the project, the idea of nuclei showed insufficient to confront the multitude of tools employed by every practice, which required extensive research of the 80s. The diverse and dispersed Latin American episodes then were articulated by 2 fundamental concepts that accompanied us through the process of preparation of the project. Affinity, those similar and parallel ways of doing in different points of Latin America, a number of key ideas that allowed us to go through the various episodes transversely, and contrast sceneries seemingly unconnected. And the another one, contagion, experiences that intersect certain tools of aesthetic creation and resistance that end up spreading like a virus in different geographies, often derivated from the contact because or caused by the exile of artists and activists in a network of common action in forms of international solidarity. Obviously, not all the episodes could fit in this methodological scheme. Some were held in a mesh simply binding for its opacity, or the perseverance of the incomprehensible to the Western European perception and the epistemological logic, problematizing even the idea of what activism is. The title, Losing the Human Form, came in the last year of the project. It suggests a picture of mutation that the Argentine musician Indio Solari recovers and resignifies from the concept from the Peruvian anthropologist Carlos Castaneda. It indicates the dissolution of the individual self, a figure that seems productive as a way to challenge the material gathered in this collective research from two perspectives. On one hand, it alludes to the massacre and extermination, the devastating effects of violence by militarist dictatorships on the bodies in the continent, the states of siege in internal wars, and on the other, it refers to the metamorphosis of bodies and experiences of resistance and freedom that occupied simultaneously during the 80s in Latin America as a replica, refugee, or subversion. Episodes were assembled as dissimilar as the creative strategies used by human rights movements to give visibility to the missing and the victims of state terrorism, the survival of the ritual Arete Guaçu, the community of Santa Terezinha in Paraguay and Chaco, practice of collective poetry, theater, music, comics, architecture, and graphic activism in contention for the public space amid the repression. The experience of sexual disobedience, party festivals, and performances in underground spaces in different countries. A complex corpus that allow us to identify the multiple and concomitant appearance of similar tactics, modes of action, and the intervention or invention of spaces in different contexts, and the coincidence of using the body as artistic and political fundamental support. Even the concept of what is political is reconfigured in the 80s, from the emergence of a complex and wide spectrum of practices and subjectivities that cross not only the underground scene, but the sexual dissidence, the friction of bodies in marches, in the clandestine deeds and underground parties, also helped to reconstruct emotional ties broken by terror. With sexual dissidence, we are referring to those subjectivities that give an account of disobeying the heterosexual norm, claiming the political condition of desire, and showing that the natural confinement of sexuality to the private domains in what actually converse distinction and public administration. I think it's not working. The emergence of sexual disobedience helped to cause critical strain on areas of organic militance. but were not necessarily a place to overcome these forms of political articulation and assemblage. With the exhibition project, we try to review practices that challenge the discourses that intend to globalize and the uniqueness of bodies and to mold them to the history of capitalism, colonialism, and heteropatriarchy. In this struggle to live or directly deny subordinate positions, sexual dissidents suppose, in many cases, an effective political alliance with the consciousness of common suffering imposed by structural violence of the system on large sections of the population. Specifically in the basements and the underground spaces, microcommunities appeal to the invention of territories prone to party, drugs, body experimentation, and promiscuous sexuality, understood as in the exhibition or in this process of research as strategies of joy. These experiences were nurtured by anarchist and libertarian legacies that drove the punk movement, the ethic of do-it-yourself, and the claim of self-management and autonomy. And here is where the porn art movement enters. The porn art movement, a direct descendant of the Brazilian poetic cannibal avant-gardes, the counterculture, the carnival, and other street demonstrations, we started a discussion that had already been around on experimentation with languages, including the potential of body and the way that language can curtail behavior. The question was how to subvert both languages and behavior to affect the prevailing system of thought and disrupt colonial obedience reinforced by long periods of dictatorship in Brazil. In this case, as Glauco Matoso, then participant of porn art movement, affirms, culture does not mean the level of knowledge, but rather a pattern of social behavior. The term counterculture was taken from the sociology and have been popularly used to indicate the marginal or any not integrated element or subject, the delinquent, homeless people, or not homeless people, or any other people from certain discriminated minority. Everything that did not fit into an established pattern became marginal. Long hair, free sex, comic slang, rock, drugs, and other flags that typify in the 80s a phenomenon of rebellion of Western new generations, rightly termed counterculture, end quote. If during the years of the Cold War, which not incidentally coincides with the military dictatorship in Brazil, the state combated outbreaks of violent leftist manifestations, at the beginning of the 80s, libertarian dissident sexual practices in different fields, art, theater, musical, and especially in public space, would be read as a threat to the social order cultivated by de facto government. This was a governmental order that did not approve in public life the visible presence of homeless, bums, drugs, fags, prostitutes, travestites, and homosexuals, minorities in general, much less no standard behaviors. It is precisely these marginal and the minority communities of the underworld that were able to contradict and disrupt the control over the desired living arrangements of that time. Some of them began to leave the ghetto and organize themselves in civil associations, which was not well regarded by the military dictatorship. In the context of the so-called opening in the late 70s and early 80s, state forces which responds to the desire of certain segment of the population coincided to focus their attention on those who represented difference within the straight order or rules imposed and affirmed by all state institutions. To complement this overview, it's necessary to remember that first, the hard line of dictatorship provoked instability in public safety by placing bombs everywhere in order to secure the military regime. And secondly, the soft line ahead of government did not know what to do with the large national debt and runaway inflation that had destabilized the country, and so had tried to show its effectiveness in methods of repressive control of the public scene. The whole situation was preparing the way for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, solution to combat underdevelopment through loans for economical recovery, which was preparing society for neoliberal economics and subjectivities for mass consumption. But what was the opening summer in Brazil? In 1979, the dictator-in-chief, General João Batista Figueiredo, had approved the amnesty law. He appropriated one of the opposition demands, but put some restrictions to the opened a major concession to the hardline regime. This was amnesty for crimes and any nature related to political and politically motivated crimes, including those responsible for torture during the military dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 to 1985. In 1979, after the law declared unrestricted amnesty, guerrillas members and militants who survived from the Condor Plain returned to Brazil, and with them another critical mindset. The porn art movement emerged in this context. In February of 1980, Veronica Majeski, at that time 17 years old, protested in the sands of Ipanema, going topless. Yeah, I think the image was before, right? Here, yeah. She was with her friends Maria Helena Autori, Cristina Rosa Isabel Amorim, and was harassed by men attending the beach. They were surrounded by more than 100 men who started to offend them and threw cups filled with sand and beer cans. They were called Genie, in reference to the music Genie Zeppelin of Chico Buarque, which refers to the sex work. Result, Monica is who ends up being arrested. The case not only denounced the conservatism of government structures having the girl arrested, but the face of that social scene. The truth on censorship during the military dictatorship, which took no rest for the most 70s, at that time only proved positive for commercial issues. And that is how female nudity was stylized and encoded for the market and the public spectacle. The following week, a group of feminists protested in Ipanema in favor of going topless, and they could sunbathe on an equal footing with men without sexualizing breasts. This generated a fact known as the topless crisis, which was crucial at that time to lead the debate on the construction of modesty and women's rights over their own bodies. It also served to demand equal rights in relation to the freedom of body in public space. The main question were, why is this only allowed for topless male bodies? Why only two female bodies can catwalk of carnival? Even today, the practice of going topless is described as an obscene act. That is why it hurt the penal code, which condemns obscene acts in public spaces. Lewd acts would be acts of sexual nature that offend the modesty and the morals of society in public space. Here we should note that what therefore characterizes an act and sexual representations as lawful or unlawful is not the content itself, but the place in which they are practiced. In few words, what they state allied with the market is still controlling for certain conservative perspectives is what can be part of the public scene and what cannot. What can still be useful for economical rationale and what cannot. What kind of criticism and public performance can be criminalized and what not, others not. And it's precisely about creating an obscene act that the gang of porno art movement were working on. The group tried to desterritorialize not only literary and artistic practice, but the visual and the verbal pornography technology, which melted rudeness, profanity, neologism, lewd jokes, blasphemy, wearing ungrammatical expressions, incorrect spellings, idioms, lexical exactions, obscenities in general, and disgusting and the grotesque. All critical appropriations and formalizations against the same hierarchical colonial aesthetic paradigms of cultural value that have been repeated without end. The porn art movement started in 2008 when Eduardo Kac met Kairos Assis Trindade and proposed that they organize a poetical march for the literally topless. That's the only image that we have about this action. One more page. And many, many images. Okay, I will pass 5 minutes, okay? No? Yeah, it's a difficult decision. Okay, so in this case, what I do is just show the video that I would talk about the first action, that's this one for the literary topless, and but you already know all the context and why they did this kind of action at that time. They are completely attached to the feminist movement, and they are trying to use their artistic tools to support this kind of social movement. So they repeated, not repeated the action, they did the same action and again in 82. And what I wanted to show you is a material that was recently recovered by this action. It's important to say that this is a completely unknown episode, and all the material have been recuperated in the last years through this research. So before but play in the video, I will just read the conclusion, and that's all, okay? So from the idea of tradition, members of the movement strategically took the poetry and the literature as territory to overthrow by a rebel burlesque project. In Brazilian 80s, under the slogan of revolution in pleasure, their actions and poems sought to create a new lexicon and a libidinal grammar to liberate sensuality, language, and subvert, incorporate minorities, as they said at that time. The poems and many other forms of oral, visual, and bodily intervention were constantly protests against the hegemony of dominant language. There is no one word that should be used. In the same way, there is no area of body or body itself that should be censored. The porn art movement sought this intersection. They sought to problematize and politicize the link between the public and private, pornography and eroticism, art and life, beyond its traditional and conservative conceptions and relationships. The interventionist program of the movement put in evidence the usual fatal, intimate, customary relationship with words and situations faced daily in those years of dictatorship, such as torture, murder committed by the state forces, censorship, control, poverty, hunger, etc. The scheme was subvert everything considered pejorative, immoral, and reprehensible about this repressive system, starting with language and its stigmatized words. So the porn art movement thus strives to celebrate the body, not the butchered body or the body as myth. It doesn't even want to fetishize the body of the poet, but rather it points to other bodies, those ones with the capability of rewrite themselves experimentally against the repressive state of normality within which we still live.
Okay, Fernanda, I think we don't have time for the video anymore. I'm sorry, because we're really like over time.
Okay.
But I think it's 40 minutes past, so it's
minutes.
No, but we're already like way over time, and there's a lot of
Okay.
people coming. So also like we have to make, but we can show it perhaps in the break.
Okay.
With the
No problem.
when we have the break. Thank you very much.